Welcome to Context. I'm Brad Harris. Quick announcement. Since returning to podcasting back in May of 2025 after an extended hiatus, I released 16 new episodes of the show, including 4 supporter-only shows. And that was a kind of experiment to see if I could gain enough voluntary listener support to continue offering the show ad-free to everybody. But what I've learned is that podcasting has become a much more crowded space in the meantime, such that most listeners are already supporting as much content as they're able to. So, going forward, I'm going to begin experimenting with running ads on the public feed. This will allow me to keep the show free for everyone while still offering an ad-free version, along with all supporter-only episodes, to those who choose to support the show through Patreon or by subscribing directly on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you're already supporting me in one of those ways, thank you. I could not do this without you. And if you are not supporting me yet, but you would like to continue to hear the show ad-free and access extra episodes each month, you can sign up on patreon.com/Brad Cole Harris or subscribe through Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Again, for everyone else, Context will remain available wherever you listen, but you'll probably start hearing some ads. All right. Let's get into today's topic. In my last 2 episodes, Law, Order, and Punishment, and Good versus Evil, I tried to grapple with the rawest questions of our time. What holds a society together? What forces tear it apart? And how do we navigate a moment when crime, disorder, and deep moral division feel ascendant in America? Recent events have rattled people. It's not just political chaos or surging crime or the steady drip of institutional failure. It's not even the political assassination of Charlie Kirk in and of itself. It's the feeling that's been building for some time now that we might be sliding into a kind of cold civil war. 2 Americas sharing one territory, but no longer one people. And the question that increasingly haunts us is this. Is there any way back from here? Can a society this fractured recover? Platitudes won't do it. Come together, agree to disagree, trust the process. These bromides ring hollow when our divisions cut so deep. If recovery is possible, it will require something more fundamental. A tectonic shift in culture, in institutions, in the basic stories we tell ourselves about who we are. That is where history can help us think about this more clearly, because as bleak as the present may seem, there's nothing new about societies teetering on the brink. Civilizations have stared into the abyss before, racked by division, decadence, even military devastation, and somehow clawed their way back. Not every society manages this, but some do, and when they succeed, their recoveries are not accidents. They are the products of human choices that give rise to new institutions, new moral commitments, and new hope for the future. So today, I want to tell the story of 3 such recoveries, 3 historical case studies. Each took place in a different era, under different circumstances, with different outcomes. Yet together, they suggest that renewal, though never guaranteed, is possible. The first case study is England in the late 15th century, emerging from the blood-soaked chaos of the War of the Roses. The second is West Germany in the mid-20th century, rising from the rubble of total defeat in 1945. And the third is America itself in the late 20th century, pulling itself out of the malaise of the 1970s. Each of these recoveries was hard-fought and imperfect and partial, but they reveal how societies, against all odds, against people's expectations, can rediscover stability, legitimacy, and even vitality in times of darkness. Let's begin in England. The Wars of the Roses weren't just an obscure dynastic squabble. They were a 30-year nightmare of civil war in England, beginning in 1455, when rival branches of the royal family turned the kingdom into their battlefield. The royal line at the time was the House of Plantagenet, which had ruled England for centuries, but by the mid 15th century, the family had split into two bitterly opposed factions: the House of Lancaster, whose symbol was the red rose, and the House of York, whose symbol was the white rose. Each side believed it had the better claim to the throne. Each raised armies from among the nobles, and over 3 decades they fought a brutal series of battles at St. Albans, Taunton, Tewkesbury, and finally Bosworth that left tens of thousands dead. Kings were toppled and murdered. Henry VI of Lancaster was deposed, restored, and then killed. Edward IV of York seized power, only to die young and leave his sons vulnerable, those boys who had become the princes in the Tower, mysteriously killed while under the protection of their uncle, Richard III. It was just a complete mess. But behind the drama was a deeper reality. England had become a kingdom of shifting allegiances where might made right and no one could feel secure. What began as a family feud erupted into a total breakdown of law and order. Noble families raised private armies and ravaged the countryside. Justice was whatever the strongest lord could impose. Merchants had no guarantee their goods would reach the market without being plundered. For decades, England had all the hallmarks of a failed state. And yet, by the year 1500, the kingdom stabilized. The man most responsible was Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII after his victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. Geoffrey Elton, the great historian of Tudor England, emphasized that Henry's genius was not battlefield brilliance, but institutional cunning. He understood that stability required more than a crown on his head. It required disciplining the nobility, rebuilding the credibility of government, and reasserting the monarchy as the arbiter of law. Henry did this with a mixture of carrot and stick. He cracked down on the medieval practice of livery and maintenance, by which nobles maintained private armies of retainers. He revived the exchequer and the court of Star Chamber to strengthen royal control over finances and justice. At the same time, he cultivated a new class of administrators, the so-called new men, drawn from the gentry and merchant ranks, whose loyalty depended not on aristocratic blood, but on royal favor. The result was a slow but steady restoration of predictability. Merchants could trade without fear of roving war bands. Courts could adjudicate disputes without being overridden by noble power. The monarchy regained legitimacy not by divine right alone, but by enforcing peace through an emergent administrative monopoly on power. Historian Stephen Gunn, in his study of Henry VII's reforms, argues that what England experienced was not simply dynastic stability, but the birth of modern governance. For the first time in a century, there was a credible sovereign power capable of disciplining elites and ensuring order. The lesson here is that recovery from collapse required consolidation. It required someone, backed by new institutions, to restrain the destructive appetites of elites. And this isn't just a peculiarity of England in the 15th century. It's a pattern that runs through the whole history of civilization. Left unchecked, elites tend to monopolize power and bend the state to their private advantage. Call it oligarchy, call it corruption, call it aristocratic arrogance. It has many faces, but the dynamic is the same. In countless other societies, from imperial China to modern Latin America, we see the same corrosion: wealth and privilege concentrating in the hands of the few until the many no longer see the system as legitimate. What Henry VII achieved in his small corner of the world at a time well before England emerged as a global power was to begin building an immune system against this kind of oligarchic infection. By disciplining the nobility, curbing their private armies, and strengthening the machinery of royal justice and finance, he limited the ability of powerful families to treat the kingdom as their plaything. As a result, ordinary people started to believe once again that law might restrain violence, that contracts might be honored, that the rules of the game might apply to everyone. England was not even yet a modern democracy, but Henry's reforms laid the groundwork for a state strong enough to protect the common man from elite predation. In that sense, England's recovery wasn't just a matter of one dynasty defeating another. It was an early experiment in something far more universal: how to contain the excesses of the powerful so that society at large can trust in the fairness of its institutions. That experiment, fragile as it was, saved England from sliding into the irrelevance of so many fractured kingdoms of the day. Instead of dissolving into a provincial backwater, England gradually stabilized, and by the time of Shakespeare and Queen Elizabeth, it stood poised to project influence across the seas and onto the world stage. 40 decades later, we arrive at another nation wrestling with collapse and rebirth: Germany, 1945. A country that, like England before, had risen to extraordinary power within Europe. But unlike England, Germany's gamble for dominance left it in utter ruin. Its cities flattened, its moral standing annihilated, its people facing a true existential crisis. It's hard for us today to imagine the scale of destruction in the aftermath of the Second World War. German cities were like moonscapes of rubble. Millions were dead, millions more displaced. The nation was occupied, divided, and disgraced. The Nazi regime had not only been defeated, but utterly discredited. For many, Germany seemed totally beyond redemption, economically broken, morally bankrupt, and culturally shattered. And yet, within one generation, West Germany was the engine of Europe. Its economic miracle astonished the world. From 1949 to 1960, West Germany's GDP quadrupled. Cities were rebuilt, industries modernized, a middle class reconstituted. By the 1970s, the Federal Republic was a prosperous democracy and a cornerstone of Western stability. How did this happen? Allied aid, like the Marshall Plan, mattered, but it was not decisive. Far more important were the choices West Germans themselves made. Chief among them was the embrace of the social market economy, championed by Ludwig Erhard. This was not laissez-faire capitalism, nor was it state socialism. It was a hybrid. Markets free enough to generate dynamism, but embedded within a framework of social protections and institutional oversight. The result was an economy both innovative and broadly legitimate. Germans could believe not only that prosperity was possible again, but that it flowed from a system which rewarded hard work, discipline, and ingenuity rather than cronyism or coercion. Equally critical was the moral refounding of the state. The new Basic Law of 1949 enshrined human dignity, democracy, and federalism. Old elites, military aristocrats, and Nazi loyalists were sidelined. A younger generation built legitimacy through transparent institutions and civic education. West Germany did not erase its past, but by confronting it, it carved a path toward a different future. In other words, Germans had to redefine who they were, not just rebuild what they had lost. For centuries, Germany had been one of the cultural jewels of Europe, home to Goethe, Beethoven, Kant. But by 1945, it had also become the name most synonymous with evil. The Holocaust was the culmination of a political culture that had fused nationalism with race hatred and discipline with destruction. For the German people to recover, they had to admit that their nation had not merely failed, it had sinned gravely. That reckoning shaped the moral character of the new Federal Republic. Unlike Japan, where war guilt was often deflected onto the emperor, in Germany there was widespread and painful acknowledgement that the Nazi horror had been enabled by ordinary Germans. Intellectuals and clergy, teachers and jurists, industrialists and farmers, millions had gone along. So the rebirth of Germany required more than an economic program. It required cultivating what Germans called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the struggle to come to terms with their Nazi past. This was a spiritual exercise in humility. School children were taught about Auschwitz. Civic institutions were rebuilt not only to be efficient, but to be transparent, and to avoid the seductions of authoritarianism. The new constitution began with a startling declaration, quote, "Human dignity shall be inviolable," end quote. That was not just legal boilerplate. It was a kind of moral baptism, a way of saying, we know what happens when dignity is denied, and we will never let it happen again. And from that refounding grew a new kind of national purpose. Germans no longer sought greatness in conquest, but in productivity, in stability, in craftsmanship, in music and philosophy, in building an orderly and just society. To the outside world, the economic miracle looked like an industrial surge. But to Germans, its deeper meaning was that they could once again believe in themselves, not as would-be masters of Europe, but as responsible citizens of it. They could still be proud to be German, but in a different way. The discipline that had once fueled militarism was redirected into precision engineering and industrial excellence. The thoroughness that had once organized genocide was redirected into bureaucratic transparency and constitutional safeguards. The same cultural energies were there, but now guided by different values. That is what made Germany's recovery so remarkable. It was not just material reconstruction. It was a moral refounding that allowed a disgraced nation to believe again in its own future and to do so in a way that inspired rather than horrified the world. Finally, let's look to America in the 1970s. The context was very different, but the mood was similarly dark. To feel its weight, we have to remember what came before. From the end of World War II through the 1960s, America had seemed unstoppable. The country had emerged from the war as the undisputed leader of the free world, its economy booming, its cities expanding, its middle class swelling with prosperity. Suburban lawns, interstate highways, new universities, and a seemingly endless stream of consumer goods embodied a confidence that the American century had arrived. But by the 1970s, that confidence had curdled into exhaustion. A series of blows, political, economic, cultural, undermined the sense that America was exceptional. Vietnam was not just a military defeat, but a moral wound, exposing the limits of American power and the duplicity of officialdom. Watergate then confirmed the rot, with a sitting president forced to resign in disgrace. Abroad, America looked diminished. At home, citizens felt betrayed. The economy, long a source of pride, sputtered under conditions no one thought possible. Stagflation, high inflation combined with stagnant growth, ate away at family savings. Oil shocks left drivers fuming in gas lines that snaked for blocks, a visceral symbol of impotence. Cities that had once been proud centers of commerce and culture fell into decay. New York teetered on the brink of bankruptcy. Detroit became shorthand for industrial collapse. Whole neighborhoods hollowed out as jobs fled and crime surged. Daily life reflected this unraveling. Parents warned their children not to walk to school alone in cities where muggings and murders spiked. The summer blackout of 1977 in New York saw looting and arson engulf entire districts, a nightmarish image of urban breakdown. Inflation meant that each trip to the grocery store felt like an insult, prices rising faster than paychecks. Factories closed, blue collar workers who had once embodied the American dream were left adrift, and the promise that each generation would live better than the last suddenly looked naive. Culturally, self doubt seeped into everything. Popular films like Taxi Driver and Apocalypse Now captured the mood of disillusionment. Even sports reflected the decline. The 1972 Munich Olympics were scarred by terrorism, while American baseball and football faced strikes and scandal. The confidence of the 1950s and early 1960s felt like a distant memory. By the late 70s, commentators spoke openly of American decline. President Jimmy Carter, in his famous malaise speech, admitted that the nation faced a crisis of confidence that struck at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. What he described was not just an economic slump or a political scandal, it was the sense that America had lost its story, that the very idea of American destiny was faltering. And yet, by the mid 1980s, the United States had turned a corner. The economy revived. Inflation was tamed, crime began its long decline, patriotism resurged. By the end of that decade, the Cold War was won without firing a shot. What happened? If there was a single flywheel that turned the gloom of the 1970s into the momentum of the 1980s, it was technology. After years of Cold War research and development seeding electronics and computing, the United States rewired the path from the lab to market. The Bayh-Dole Act of 1980 let universities own and license inventions from federally funded research, turning campuses into commercialization engines rather than patent graveyards. Tech transfer offices multiplied, startups clustered around research universities, and venture capital finally had something proprietary to finance. In parallel, computer researchers knitted together supercomputer centers and regional networks into a national backbone, accelerating the move from research networking to the early commercial internet, a hidden infrastructure choice that would change the texture of daily life within a decade. And when IBM launched the PC in 1981, it legitimized personal computing for corporate America, standardizing an ecosystem that software entrepreneurs could confidently build for. Within months of that, orders were in the six figures, and the platform logic that would power the 1980s was set. Like never before, innovation not only accelerated, it became predictable and investable. The second flywheel was finance, and here, the story is not some caricature of deregulation, but a series of painful, contested choices that restored credibility to money and rewired capital flows. The Volcker disinflation between 1979 and 1982 imposed sky-high interest rates to break inflation's back, proving to households and investors that the dollar would be defended, even at short-term cost. Meanwhile, rule changes and statutory shifts in the late 1970s and early 80s opened channels for capital to seek new risk. Pension funds gained more latitude to invest in venture capital and private markets. High-yield bonds financed corporate restructurings. Securitization broadened funding bases. The net effect was that the finance industry exploded, which meant that, whatever its later excesses, money managers succeeded in mobilizing vast pools of savings and other dormant capital into new technology, corporate reorganization, and urban redevelopment. So if the tech ecosystem provided a powerful new engine for growth, this new financial architecture provided the gasoline. But technology and finance still needed a kind of cultural permission structure, a way for a weary public to believe that striving to build and invest and even thrive again was not naive. The 1980s resurgence of confidence grew from more than some slogan like "Morning in America again." People were not simply told to feel good, they saw systems actually work. Inflation receded, grocery prices stabilized, payrolls grew. They saw new industries hiring. They saw Los Angeles pull off a privately financed 1984 Olympics without catastrophe. They saw personal computers arrive on their office desks, and soon, modems tie them to a globalizing world. The cultural mood improved because countless daily frictions eased. Put together, these three factors, policy enabled technology, credibility restoring finance, and a culture that could once again recognize and embrace real progress, explain why the American turnaround of the 1980s was more than campaign rhetoric. So, what do these three cases teach us? First, that none of this was automatic or inevitable. Even though in hindsight, it would be easy to assume that England, Germany, and the United States were somehow destined to become or remain great powers. Each recovery was partial, each demanded leadership and sacrifice and widespread civic buy in. But each case study proves that societies, like individuals, have agency, and that collapse is not destiny. Today, in America, the temptation when we face our potential unraveling is either fatalism or fantasy. Fatalism says that the fracture in American society has become permanent and that civil war, cold or hot, is inevitable. Fantasy says that a single election or a single law or a single leader can somehow make us whole again. History provides a more useful lens. It suggests that renewal happens when a society takes up three kinds of work at once: renewed discipline, renewed principles, and renewed patriotism. Renewed discipline is the unglamorous work of constraining the elites, of making it costly even for them to bend the rules, privatize public power, or game the system because they have the influence. That was Henry VII's great contribution. Renewed principles demands deeper work, deciding again what is inviolable and building around it. West Germany's Basic Law began with the affirmation that human dignity is universal and non-negotiable. This re-anchored the whole German order. Renewed patriotism is cultural. It's the freedom to believe in the worth of your own society without that belief being treated as partisan. America's recovery in the 1980s felt different, not only because prices stabilized or new industries took off, but because people felt allowed to be proud again. Patriotism wasn't a dirty word. It was the common ground that let a fractured nation imagine a future together. That's the permission we need today, to say without irony or fear that we want America to be great, and to mean it not as some partisan chant, but as a nationwide, civic aspiration. We can acknowledge our failures while still being grateful for the unique tools this country gives us. If we stop obsessing only over what's wrong and start believing again in what can be made right, patriotism becomes a source of cohesion rather than division. None of this would necessarily mean that America today achieves unanimity. England remained contentious, Germany argued fiercely about memory and identity, and America in the 1980s was hardly tranquil. Renewal doesn't eliminate conflict, but it can civilize it. We're not condemned to a civil war. We may yet remember how to disagree agreeably. But that will not happen incidentally. It can only happen deliberately. And it must be modeled relentlessly in our families, where we teach our children how to behave in civil society, in our education system, where we teach young minds how to think in a liberal democracy, and in our government, where we expect a more mature kind of politics that refuses to treat disagreement as hate. That is where the discipline and the principles and the patriotism of a free people come from. And it is the only way the renewal we need will ever take root. I'm Brad Harris. So long.